with the White House using every lever of power to shut down pro-Palestine activism. It's happening in the courts, in the media, and of course on campuses. Last night, dozens of students at Columbia University were arrested and threatened with deportation following the largest pro-Palestinian campus action since last year's encampment protests. More than 70 students were cuffed and arrested by NYPD police officers after staging a sit-in inside Columbia's Butler Library. Students told us they were prevented by campus security from leaving the library unless they agreed to scan their student IDs, while administrators accused the demonstrators of endangering the safety of other students preparing for their final exams. Columbia University's acting president, Claire Shipman, released a video statement saying she was present when police arrived and said their actions were orderly and limited.
I'm deeply disturbed at the idea that at a moment when our international community feels particularly vulnerable, a small group of students would choose to make our institution a target. There's a line between legitimate protest and actions that endanger others and disrupt the fundamental work of the university. Today, that line was crossed, and I have confidence the disciplinary proceedings will reflect the severity of the actions.
But a Columbia student journalist present inside the library captured the arrests on her phone and says a number of students were injured during scuffles with security and the police.
We're outside of Columbia University, where dozens of students were arrested for staging a pro-Palestine protest inside a library. At 3 p.m., over 100 students entered a room in Butler Library and renamed it the Bassett Al-Ada's Popular University, where they shed light on the atrocities in Gaza. Immediately after, campus security shut the doors, preventing anyone from coming in, including student press, and prevented anyone from leaving unless they showed their student ID and risked getting disciplinary sanctions in the process.
What is the legal basis of arresting students for not showing ID? In order to arrest someone, they must have done something illegal.
Campus security assaulted several students, leaving many of them injured in the process. This comes as dozens of students were expelled and suspended this year for protesting against the war in Gaza.
And you may wonder why the protests at Columbia all have their faces covered, something that the university has now banned at the behest of the White House. Well, you just need to look back at the response from U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Let's have a look at that tweet again. Quote, "We are reviewing the visa statuses of trespassers and vandals who took over Columbia University's library. Pro-Hamas thugs are no longer welcome in our great nation." Unquote. These students understand they are risking a lot by speaking out. They face arrest, expulsion, their degrees and scholarships could be denied to them as they have with others. And even if they are green card holders, they could be detained and deported. Now, earlier you watched that report that we got from Columbia journalism student Tamara Turk. She joins us now live on the program. Tamara, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, I want to begin with the words of acting Columbia President Claire Shipman. You may have heard her earlier in the program. She said that she was there present when those students were arrested last night. She said the police's actions were limited and orderly. You were there inside the library. What did you see?
I mean, what I saw yesterday was a complete abuse of power by Columbia, any total weaponization of its collaboration with the New York Police Department, which has a long-standing history and documented history of police violence. And I did not see Claire Shipman there.
What did you see? Describe as much as you can.
So around 3 p.m., students had staged a protest inside one of the main reading rooms in Butler Library. And immediately after, campus security had blocked all entrances, preventing anyone from coming in or coming out. A few students tried to come inside the room and were shoved and slammed to the ground. And it only took a few minutes before Columbia threatened to invite NYPD onto campus to arrest students. I think I like the repression has been so severe, and every single time I think it can't get any worse than this, but it truly does. Um, as a student journalist, I feel like it's not my job to be the university administration stenographer and to repeat university talking points. So on the scene, I asked campus security repeatedly on what legal basis were they trying to arrest students, to which they were throwing out statements like trespass and occupying a building, and none of this was true. First of all, to enter Colombia, you must be a student and you must swipe in with your student ID. So there was no evidence of trespass at this point. And the students had not occupied the building, nor had they ever intended to. And in fact, when Colombia said that it was threatening to make arrest, students for hours were begging to leave. To which Colombia refused unless they identified themselves, and this is with the very specific intent of disciplining them. And it's important to note that this comes as dozens of students have been suspended and expelled this year, but also that there's an ongoing lawsuit by students against Colombia to block it from sharing any private disciplinary records with a government that is actively going after detaining and deporting non-US citizen students for protesting against the genocide in Gaza. Um, I, I mean, essentially what Colombia did was strip away any agency that these students had because they were giving them two alternatives that jeopardized both their education and their safety. And I also think that this sets a very worrying precedent that Colombia can legally arrest students for breaking a minor school rule, like refusing to identify themselves. I also think it's very concerning that campus security felt emboldened to shove and assault students, which injured many in the process. At one point, I went to a campus security officer and told him that a student was exhibiting symptoms of a concussion, and needed medical attention, to which his immediate response was, well, is she going to show student ID? Because we're not going to let her out of the building. And so, I mean, essentially withholding medical attention from a student that they had injured, because they were so intent on cracking down on pro-Palestine activism.
Thank you for that very vivid description. Now, I want to ask you about the timing of this protest. We are just days away from finals. A lot of students are preparing to finish their term. Some of them might be graduating at the end of this term. Why now to take an action like this?
I mean, over the last few months, we've seen a ramping in the repression and crackdown of pro-Palestine activism. And I think students felt it was very important to send a signal to Colombia that they refuse to be intimidated. They will not back down until Colombia financially divests from all companies that are complicit in the genocide in Gaza. I think what we've seen over the last, few months are students are feeling really scared right now. And I think sending this display of, confidence and refusing to, cower, felt like an important decision for them.
And tell me more about this climate. There is a lot happening in the country right now. There are cases that are taking place in courts across the country. There is this promise by Secretary of State Marco Rubio just overnight that some of those students that were arrested yesterday, their visas are going to be checked. Some of them could be at risk of detention and deportation, as some of their colleagues, Mahmoud Khalil and Mohsen Mahdawi in particular, have faced this year. What are students feeling, especially those that may have taken part in protests, not just yesterday, but in the past?
I mean, I think it's very difficult to intimidate students that are drawing their strength from a community that is remaining steadfast in the midst of a genocide. For me, as a Palestinian journalist in the diaspora and here in the West, it felt very difficult for me to not be there, and document despite the risk of arrest. when I'm seeing my colleagues on the ground endure bombardment, siege, and starvation. The atmosphere on campus has felt very dystopian over the last few months, especially since Mahmoud's detainment. We've seen a ramp up of security presence, and also there's been 36 new private security officers that have been designated to make arrests on campus. The surveillance is also ramping up in that we've had a private investigator show up to a student's home. This had happened last year, but I think, at least for me, when I'm on campus, I constantly feel like I'm being watched and surveilled. And I think there's a very visible display of that, so that students know that they're being watched at every moment. And although there are a lot of students that are feeling incredibly frightened right now, and understandably so, you also have another set of students that have just been so heartbroken by what's happening in Gaza, and the images that have come out since the ceasefire was broken, that feel that there are no political conditions that could ever get them to stop fighting against the genocide. It's the crime of all crimes.
Tamara Turki, we deeply appreciate your time with us today, as well as your reporting. Best of luck for your finals next week.